You smelled it before you even got through the gate. Not the garden, not the street, something deeper. Pipe tobacco caught in curtain fabric. Furniture polish worked into wood that had been worked into for decades. Something slow cooking in the back of the house, building since morning. And underneath all of that, the house itself. A smell that had no name but that you knew completely. Every time you catch it now, without warning, in a corridor, in an old shop, in someone else's home, you stop, just for a second. Because you're 8 years old again, and you're walking up that garden path, and nothing bad has happened yet. This is what it actually felt like to be a child visiting your nan and granddad's house in 1970s Britain. And if you were one of those children, you already know exactly where this is going. Sunday was the day. Not because anyone chose it consciously, just because that's what Sunday was for. You went, same time, same route, same garden path you could have walked blindfolded. The gnomes were still there, granddad's roses trimmed tight along the border, the vegetable patch behind them, runner beans climbing their canes in straight lines. Everything kept. Everything in its place. The front door had frosted glass and a brass knocker. Maybe one of those mechanical doorbells you pressed hard and heard echoing all the way down the hall. But your family didn't use the front door. Nobody did. You went round the back. The front door was for strangers, for the doctor, for funerals and people who didn't know better. The back door was the real entrance, and Nan had it open before you reached it. She'd been watching from behind the net curtains. She always knew. She always knew before you knocked. The warmth hit you first. Their house was always warmer than yours. Always. That wall of heat the moment you stepped inside. It was like the house itself was welcoming you, pulling you in. And then the hallway. Patterned carpet in deep reds and browns. Granddad's flat cap on the same hook it had lived on since before you were born. The telephone table with the heavy rotary handset sitting on it. Rented from the post office, not owned. A small notepad beside it with numbers written in biro. And then you'd notice the ticking. A mantle clock. A wall clock. Something somewhere. Always ticking. That house was never truly silent. Even in the quiet moments, it breathed. It marked the time. It reminded you gently that the afternoon was moving, even when it felt like it wasn't. You didn't think about any of that then. You just felt it. Safe. Contained. Like nothing outside those walls could quite reach you. But the house had a secret room. And that's where we're going next. Every grandparent's house in 1970s Britain had 2 living rooms, and one of them was off limits. Not officially, nobody sat you down and explained the rules. You just knew. The way children always know things that were never spoken out loud. The front room, the best room, the room nobody used. It was slightly colder in there. The fire was never lit. The curtains were kept half drawn, as if the furniture needed protecting from the light. The air smelled different from the rest of the house, still and faintly stale. Like a room that had been waiting a long time for something that never quite arrived. There was a 3-piece suite that nobody sat on comfortably. Lace doilies draped over the backs and arms of every chair, the kind that slid off the moment you brushed past them. A display cabinet stood against the wall filled with things you were absolutely not to touch. Royal Doulton figurines, a thimble collection, glass animals in a row, commemorative plates. And if it was late in the decade, almost certainly a silver Jubilee plate from 1977, polished and perfectly placed. The sideboard held the crystal decanters, heavy-cut glass, always gleaming. Sherry in one, something stronger in another. They came out at Christmas or when someone important visited. The glasses matched. Nobody questioned why they were kept so carefully. They just were. And somewhere in that room, in an oval frame or propped carefully on the sideboard, photographs. A black and white wedding portrait. Someone in uniform from the war, young and straight-backed and serious. And tucked among them, slightly out of date, a little grinning face in last year's school jumper. You didn't know that room, the cold room, the untouched room, the room nobody used, was also the room where they put the things that mattered most to them. You didn't know what it meant that it was in there, among the things they kept most carefully. You only understood that years later, long after you couldn't tell them. That room was never for living in, it was for keeping. The real room was through the back, and the moment you crossed into it, everything changed. The temperature came up, the air moved. Something was always on. The radio, the television, a conversation half finished from last week. This was where the family actually existed, where the day actually happened, and at the center of it all, the kitchen. Nan's kitchen. Always warm, always slightly busy, always smelling of something that made you feel like everything was going to be fine. The kettle was on before your coat was off. Tea was already being made, properly made, not in mugs, in a pot. The pot warmed first with boiling water, swirled around and tipped away. Then the tea went in. Then the knitted cozy went over the top, shaped like a cottage or a hen or something you could never quite identify. Cups and saucers. Always cups and saucers. Nobody drank out of mugs at Nan's. The saucer was used properly. A spoon rested on it. Tea cooled on it if it came too hot. There was a rightness to it that you absorbed without ever being taught. And then the tin. You knew the tin before you could read the lid. It was almost certainly a repurposed biscuit tin. Quality Street maybe, or Rose's, or Huntley and Palmer's. The kind that arrived at Christmas full of something good and then got quietly reassigned to a different life. The lid was slightly stiff. You lifted it carefully, with a kind of reverence you couldn't have explained. Sometimes it held sewing things. Buttons, needles, tangled threads in colors that hadn't matched anything since 1962. Absolute heartbreak. You'd put the lid back and try not to show it on your face. But when it held actual biscuits, everything was right with the world. Custard creams, bourbons, rich tea, ginger nuts, nice biscuits with the coconut sugar on top. Half a digestive that had been in there since Tuesday and had gone slightly soft at the edges. You were offered one. You wanted 3. You took 2 and hoped nobody was counting. Somebody was always counting. The worktops were Formica. The tablecloth was wiped clean, usually floral. Fairy liquid sat beside the sink and there was no dishwasher. There was never a dishwasher. The dish drainer beside the taps held everything stacked at an angle that had no right to work, and yet somehow always did. An entire architecture of plates and bowls and cups balanced through experience alone. Something was already in the oven. It had been in there since before you arrived, building slowly, filling the house from the inside out. You didn't need to ask what it was. Your body already knew. Through to the back room, the room everyone actually lived in. Smaller than the front room, more worn, more honest. The carpet was patterned, swirling Axminster in browns and oranges and a deep muddy teal, slightly rough against your knees when you dropped to the floor. And you did drop to the floor. That carpet was where you spent hours, chin in your hands, watching the telly, sorting through a tin of old buttons for no reason, except that it felt like the most important thing in the world. At the center of that room, Granddad's chair. You knew which one it was. Everyone knew. Nobody sat in it, not even when he wasn't there. It faced the television at exactly the right angle, and it had a dip in the cushion shaped precisely like him. It faced the television at exactly the right angle, and it had a dip in the cushion shaped precisely like him. Like the chair had slowly, over years, become a portrait. That was his spot. It had always been his spot. It would always be his spot. The television was a heavy wooden box, either on legs or sitting on its own little cabinet. In the early part of the decade, plenty of grandparents still had a black and white set. Color was arriving, but slowly, and not everywhere at once. The set might have been rented from Radio Rentals, or DER, or Rumbelows, because renting a television was completely normal and nobody thought twice about it, and you didn't have it on in the background. That's the thing people forget now. You sat down and watched it, together. The Radio Times sat on the arm of Granddad's chair, circled in biro. Coronation Street, The Two Ronnies, Morecambe and Wise, The Generation Game. When those programs came on, the room went quiet, and every face turned to the screen. And for those 30 minutes, the whole house held its breath. That was television. That was what it meant then. But the part of that afternoon nobody ever warns you about, the part that stays longer than anything else, is still coming. If Nan ruled the kitchen, Granddad ruled outside. You understood this without being told. The same way you understood about the front room, about the chair, about the biscuit tin. There were rules in that house that nobody wrote down because nobody needed to. You just knew. The shed door was always slightly stiff. It opened into a different world, cooler than the house. Smelling of linseed oil and old wood and sawdust swept into corners and left there to settle. Tools hung on nails in a specific order that only made sense to him. Jars of screws sorted by size on a shelf above the workbench. An old radio balanced on a plank, tuned to something he'd never changed and never would. He was always working on something in there, fixing, building, storing things that would definitely come in useful one day. You never quite knew what the project was. It didn't matter. What mattered was being allowed in, being handed a piece of wood and told to hold it steady while he sawed, being asked to pass the smaller one, standing there, useful, part of something that felt serious and real. That was Granddad's way of saying he was glad you were there. The garden was an extension of the same seriousness. Runner beans up their canes, potatoes earthed up in rows, leeks, rhubarb, cabbages. Everything in lines, everything growing, everything accounted for. Some granddads had an allotment too, a short walk away, a proper plot among a quiet community of men, who didn't say much to each other but showed up every week and got on with it. Standing there, useful, part of something that felt serious and real. That was Granddad's way of saying he was glad you were there. If you were there on a Sunday afternoon, you saw the ritual, the leather pouch, Condor, maybe, or St. Bruno, the slow, deliberate filling of the bowl, pressing the tobacco down with his thumb. The match struck carefully, the first few pulls until it caught properly, the smoke building, the room-changing smell entirely. He'd settle back. The pipe would go between his teeth. His shoulders would drop half an inch. If you close your eyes right now, some of you can still find that smell. Not tobacco in general. That specific tobacco. That specific room. That specific man. These are the things that don't make it into any history book. The texture of a Sunday. The weight of an ordinary afternoon. Nobody thought to write it down because nobody thought it would ever need writing. But dinner was coming, and dinner was the main event. Not lunch, not a meal. Dinner. Sunday dinner. The thing Nan had been quietly building toward since early morning. Long before anyone arrived, long before the kettle went on or the biscuit tin came out. The oven had been on for hours. The whole house had been filling with it. That deep, slow, roasting smell that meant something was about to happen. A proper roast. Beef, or pork, or chicken. Potatoes done in the fat from the meat, edges crisped and dark, carrots boiled soft, cabbage. Yorkshire puddings if it was beef, risen and golden and slightly uneven in the tin. Gravy made from the drippings in the roasting pan. Dark and thick and tasting of everything that had come before it. Nobody measured anything. Nobody needed to. The knowledge lived in her hands. The table was set properly. Cloth down, best plates out, salt and pepper in the center, HP sauce within reach. And then Granddad stood at the head of the table with the carving knife. And that was the signal that everything was about to begin. Nobody else touched that knife, that was understood. The carving was his. Sleeves rolled to the elbow, standing at the head of the table like it was the most important job in the house. Because in that moment, it was. He carved slowly and deliberately, the slices laid out on the plate with a care that looked almost ceremonial, and plates came back piled high. Nobody left that table hungry. Nan made sure of it personally. You'd push a last roast potato around your plate, certain you were done, and she'd already be asking if you wanted more. Saying no once was difficult. Saying no twice was essentially pointless. You took the extra potato. You were glad you did. Pudding followed. Always cold pudding. Never dessert, not in that house, not in that decade. Tinned peaches or pears with carnation, evaporated milk poured from a tin with 2 holes punched in the top. Or rice pudding with the brown skin on top that you either loved completely or pushed quietly to the side. Or a steamed sponge with bird's custard, made from powder in a jug, stirred with hot milk until it thickened, poured over everything in a pale yellow wave. That custard went on everything. It was the punctuation at the end of every Sunday sentence. Then the washing up, which was not optional. Nan washed, you dried. That was the arrangement, and the tea towel was in your hands before you'd fully registered what was happening. There was a method to it. She passed, you dried, you stacked, no rushing, no shortcuts. The radio might have been on in the background, or she might have talked to you quietly about something you can't quite remember now, only that her voice was steady and warm and close. After dinner, the afternoon changed pace entirely. Everything slowed, the light shifted. The room settled into a different kind of quiet, fuller, heavier, content. Granddad was asleep in his chair within 20 minutes of his last mouthful. Head back, mouth slightly open. This was simply what happened after Sunday dinner. The same way grace was part of the meal, and the washing up was part of the clearing. It was woven in. Nan sat opposite, knitting, the needles going the whole time. A soft, rhythmic clicking that filled the silence without breaking it. A cardigan taking shape on her lap that grew a little longer every Sunday. Sometimes a jumper for you. In a color she'd chosen, in a pattern she liked, that you'd have to wear at least once and pretend to love. Board games came out of the sideboard cupboard. Ludo, snakes and ladders, drafts, dominoes. A pack of cards held together with an elastic band, the corners soft with age. The boxes were held together with not much more than habit. These games were old. Older than you. Some of them older than your parents. Granddad didn't let you win. That's the thing worth saying clearly. He played properly, considered his moves, and beat you at drafts 3 times in a row without apology. And when he did, he'd just tap the board lightly and say, "Again?" And somehow, that was better than losing on purpose would ever have been. It meant he was taking you seriously. It meant you were worth playing against. You sat on the carpet sorting through Nan's button tin, a different tin from the kitchen one, older, heavier, full of buttons in every size and color, from every decade of her adult life. You sorted them into piles for no reason at all. Reds here, browns there, the large brass ones in a line. You could do that for an hour and nobody asked you to stop. Nobody needed you to be anything other than exactly where you were. And that feeling, that particular unrepeatable feeling of being completely allowed to just exist, is what nobody warned you you'd miss. Nan never sat still, not really. Even after cooking a full roast dinner for everyone, even after washing every plate and pan and serving dish by hand, she was already thinking 3 steps ahead. The knitting needles kept going. The sewing basket beside her chair held an entire quiet world. Needles, thimbles, cotton reels in colors she'd never use. All but couldn't bring herself to throw away. Her handbag sat in its usual spot, in its usual corner, exactly where it always was. And at some point in the afternoon, without ceremony, she'd reach into it. She'd fish around for a moment, find what she was looking for, and pull it out. A sweet wrapped in a tissue, a humbug, a pear drop. A butterscotch that had been in there since last week and had fused slightly to the wrapper. She'd hand it over like it was the most natural thing in the world. No fuss. No production. Just here. That small moment. That tiny, unhurried gesture. It's the kind of thing you'd never think to put on a list of important memories. And yet it stayed. It stays still in people who are now in their 50s and 60s, who can close their eyes and feel the specific softness of a tissue-wrapped sweet pressed into their palm by a woman who is no longer here. The things we carry are almost never the things we expected to carry. Sunday tea came later, lighter than dinner, laid out on the table like it had been considered. Sandwiches on white bread, crusts cut off, thin and neat. Meat paste or fish paste from a jar, tinned salmon with the small bones still in that nobody mentioned, ham sliced fine. Everything arranged on a plate because presentation mattered. Even on an ordinary Sunday, even with no one important coming. And then the cake, almost always homemade. A Victoria sponge with jam in the middle, dusted with icing sugar. A fruit cake that had been sitting in its tin for a week and tasted better for it. If it was a bought one, Mr. Kipling, a Battenberg in its yellow and pink squares. A box of fondant fancies passed around the table. The good plates came out for tea. Gold-rimmed, kept for visits, washed by hand because there was no other way. And then it was time to go. Though leaving was never quick, it was never just leaving. Coats were fetched. Nan appeared from the kitchen with things wrapped in foil. Leftovers, cake in a tin you'd need to bring back next week, vegetables from the garden. In a carrier bag, you didn't get a say in this, you were taking it home. That was final. At the door, Granddad pressed something into your hand. A coin. The big 7-sided 50 pence from his trouser pocket, still warm from being carried all day. He gave it to you quietly without announcement and you took it the same way, sometimes with a whispered, "Don't tell your mother." You closed your fingers around it and put it straight in your pocket and felt, for reasons you couldn't have articulated, like you'd been trusted with something that mattered. The goodbye took longer than it had any right to. One more thing said, one more thing remembered, just standing on the step while the cold air came in from outside. And nobody moved to close the door. You walked down the path, turned back. She was still there. In the doorway or at the window, hand raised, watching. She always waited until you were completely out of sight, every single time, without exception. You'd reach the corner, turn one last time, and she'd still be there. You didn't know then that you were storing all of this. You thought you were just having a Sunday. But some part of you knew to pay attention. Some part of you understood, even at 8 years old, that this was the kind of thing that doesn't come back. That one day, you'd be sitting somewhere quiet, and a smell would reach you from nowhere. Pipe tobacco, furniture polish, something slow in an oven, and the whole afternoon would return. Complete, intact, more vivid than almost anything that came after. That's what they gave you, without knowing they were giving it. Not things, not lessons, just Sundays, just themselves, just the ordinary, irreplaceable weight of being somewhere you completely belonged. If any of this took you somewhere you haven't been in a while, share it in the comments. Tell us what you remember. And if you know someone who grew up this way, send this to them. They'll know exactly what it means.